All right, good. I think we've got a critical mass to do the introduction. Great. It's wonderful to see you also. First, Aladdin couldn't come today, so he asked me, partially because I invited Isaac to come present for our school. So in case you don't know me, I'm Eric Heckler, professor in our school of public health, associate dean for community partnerships and all that stuff. So nice to see everybody. I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Isaac Martin, who is the chair of here at UCSD's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. He's actually a sociologist by training, and Isaac and I had a chance to meet each other actually through some activities related to the design lab. And he started telling me about some of his work, and particularly this, it seemed like just a really interesting area that I thought a lot of us in public health might find interesting. So I will, without further ado, I'll just step out of the way and let Isaac take us over. Thanks, Dr. Martin, again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to sort of have the chance to share this work and talk a little bit about what it might mean in the context of public health. So the title, How to Design a Popular Tax, might seem like a provocation. I think we're used to thinking of taxation as sort of, everybody hates taxes. But as I hope to show you, indeed, we have lots and lots of examples of tax policies that are very popular. And I've spent the last several years trying to really understand what it is about policy design, if anything, that makes a difference. That is, if we have to pay for public goods, including such basic public goods as sewer systems and public hospitals and the like, are there more and less popular ways of designing the financing mechanisms that will then make those public goods more or less politically sustainable in the long run? The kind of motivation for this project, I think it is a little unusual for a sociologist to study taxes. Certainly at the time I started this project, basically, I couldn't find anyone else in my discipline who knew the first thing about taxation. It was seen as a subject for economists and lawyers, and a lot of my, colleagues who I learned a lot together with were legal historians in particular. But I was really inspired actually by something that Alice Rivlin, the economist Alice Rivlin, who founded the Congressional Budget Office, said in 1989 to the American Economics Association, which is that the tax debates of the next few years are likely to be less concerned with the equity and efficiency of taxes, that is the classical kind of issues of economic analysis, than with their political acceptability. And she said, and therefore, we might actually need to take a cue from the psychologists and from the sociologists and from people who can help us think through some of the issues about what makes a policy more or less politically acceptable. I sort of took that as my manifesto and my charge as a sociologist to kind of try to shed some light on what it is that makes a tax more or less politically acceptable. And I came to this to give you a very brief personal background. I came to this subject through some exposure to California's health system. As a young person coming to California in the late 1990s, I found work working for a labor union of healthcare workers. And my job was to assist the union in wage bargaining and in its strategic planning and so forth with research. And one of the things that really struck me about that job is how much time the employers in the industry were spending doing things like going to the California Health Facilities Financing Authority and proposing a new bond, or going to the Assessment Appeals Board of the City and County of San Francisco and asking for a tax break, or going to the voters and asking voters to support more funding for something as basic as emergency medical services. This is Measure J from San Leandro, California from 1997. I have some memory of phone banking for this one. And EMS tax to fund emergency service or emergency fire dispatch, fire apparatus-based paramedics and other EMS-related programs, etc. The idea that for something as basic as emergency medical services, we would engage in this very kind of grassroots political process was surprising to me as someone who had not grown up in California. By the way, the voters went for it. 82% of the electorate in San Leandro voted for Measure J. They voted for that tax. Here we have an example of a popular tax, and it's actually a paradigm example for reasons I'll get into in a moment. So, okay, we have the puzzle is, what is it that makes us more willing to fund some public goods than others? And one of the things I think I learned or thought I learned from my experience in the 90s, doing actual kind of political legwork around this question, was that a lot of times the answer seemed to have less to do with people's, or not, at least not only to do with people's attitudes about the public service in question, but also to do with their attitudes about taxation. And that piqued my interest, and that was where I have then sought to kind of learn something new. And I've sought to learn something new by exploiting something really unique about California. Our local governments are laboratories of fiscal democracy in a way that is unique, not just in the United States, but in the history of the world. Nowhere else in no other time in history have so many people been asked so often to weigh in publicly, to vote on the taxes that they pay. And this is a relatively recent feature of California. And ever since 1978, there was a constitutional amendment called Proposition 13 that included lots of provisions. It's mostly thought of as a limitation on the property tax, but it also contained this provision that said at the local level, a special tax can only be approved if 2/3 of the voters agree. It nowhere defined what a special tax was, and that question kept the courts busy for another decade or so. It got clarified that a special tax meant a tax for a particular purpose, a tax that is earmarked for a special use. The opposite of that in California law then is a general tax. And in 1986, another ballot measure at the state level clarified that a general tax also needs voter approval, but the threshold is lower. A bare majority can approve a general tax. And in 1996, the voters again amended the state constitution to kind of remove some exceptions. And so since 1996, there have been basically no exceptions to this. Anytime any local government in the state of California wants to increase any tax on anyone for any purpose at all, it has to go to the voters. Now, that is unusual. And it has created an extraordinary record for us of thousands of local tax measures every year since 1986. On average, slightly less than 100 local tax measures per year somewhere in the state of California go to the voters. And so I set out about 10 years ago to collect the archive. Hired some graduate students, spent a long time phone banking the good county clerks of the great state of California and city attorneys' offices and so on, and county archives, trying to find the text of every tax law that had been put to voters, and the so-called impartial analysis, which is a short textual summary that's provided to the voters and of no more than 500 words, and the content of which can be litigated. So there's a lot of pressure to kind of write it accurately, or at least write it in a way that is sufficiently informative and sufficiently uncontroversial that you won't land in court. That was a job of work because California has a lot of local governments. There are 58 counties. We have 1,029 school districts. I think that's still the current count, although it changes from year to year. 482 municipalities and more than 3,000 special districts. And this voter approval requirement for taxation applies to all of them. So there are a lot of tax elections in the state. Our objective, mine and my team, was to collect the records of these elections and to digitize the policy text and then to analyze it to see what we could infer about the effects of policy design. One of the most important things to understand going in is that support for municipal tax measures has increased over time. Most tax measures that are taken to the voters do indeed pass, and that percentage has been increasing over time. The correlation here is, I think it is about 0.8, and both of these things correlate with just with the passage of time at about 0.7. So there's a clear positive trend, at least from the mid 90s to the early 2010s, in voter approval of local taxation. Now, part of the reason so many of these passed might be that there was sort of some change in public opinion or something in California over this period that leads to that. I think as plausible, at least, is the hypothesis that local governments have become more sophisticated and more careful about what they bring to the voters, that in effect only the most popular tax policies now are likely to come to a vote. But the bottom line for our purposes is that there's a lot of variation to exploit here. There's a lot of measures that pass, there are a lot of measures that don't pass, an enormous amount of variation, and therefore a lot to be learned. Those measures are also really different from each other in very interesting ways. California law is very permissive with respect to how local governments tax. There are a couple exceptions: no income tax at the local level in California, and no tax on the value of real property in excess of 1%. But within those constraints, local governments have been really creative in figuring out ways to design policies that are, acceptable under state law, and presenting them to the voters to pay for public goods. And so I want to highlight a couple of key findings now, and tell you, I'll dig in more deeply as there's time, but a couple of key findings that are worth noting. First, the most important finding, I think, and the most consistent finding, is that voters like any given tax rate better after they have already started to pay it. I'll give you two examples here, one from our analysis of a subset of the school district data. These are all parcel taxes. That's a flat rate tax per parcel of property for levied on property owners. And the comparison here is between proposals to introduce or increase a tax. That is the orange bar, and the blue bar represents proposals to continue an existing rate of tax that is otherwise scheduled to expire. And when we look at this contrast, we see that if the proposal is to increase the tax to any given percentage, shall we increase sales tax to 9%? Or I guess in this case, school district parcel taxes. Shall we increase school district parcel taxes to this amount? The percentage of people voting yes is 67%. If you come back 5 years later and you say, okay, that's going to expire, can we keep it at that rate? You can get to 73% of voters saying yes. And of course, a 5 percentage point difference in this domain is massive, because we're talking about elections that are fought at the margin, where a fraction of a percentage point, if it crosses that threshold at 2/3, can mean the difference between passage and failure. Municipal taxes, similar analysis here of municipal taxes, a wider variety of tax instruments, including business license taxes, parcel taxes, sales taxes, and the like. And in the aggregate, we find the same comparison. If we're talking about a given tax, a given level of taxation, people are more likely to say, yes, I will continue paying that level of taxation if I already pay it, than they are to say, yes, I will pay that level of taxation if it's an increase over a current level they're already familiar with. All of these models controlled to the best of our, these are observational data. They're fixed effects models for with intercepts, regression models with intercepts that are specific to the jurisdiction. And so these are really sort of within school district and within municipality comparisons of different measures over time, with adjustment for various demographic features of the electorate, with adjustments for the partisan coloration of the electorate, and so on. So the question is, why voters like a tax rate better after they're familiar with it? And one possibility is that it's mere status quo bias. People just get used to something. And we've tried to approach this with some experimental data. The experimental data in this domain are difficult. We went with some survey vignettes, so presenting people with a fictitious scenario and randomizing who got which version of the scenario to see what we could learn. In the first experiment, we asked people to imagine they're a longtime resident of an imaginary city in California that has a budget shortfall and proposed a sales tax increase to them, which we described. And, will you vote for it? In one treatment, in one sort of arm here, the proposal is to maintain current levels of park services and levy a new temporary sales tax. In the other, it is to continue a temporary sales tax that is scheduled to expire. But in both cases, the question before the voters is literally the same. It's, do you want your tax rate next year to be 8.25% or 8%, right? So it's the same economic question put to them. No difference. So in this sort of fictitious version of the scenario, we were not able to reproduce the pattern that we find in the observational data. And the mere fact of kind of setting up a kind of status quo comparison, at least in the context of a single experimental vignette, doesn't do it. So another possibility is because they like how the funds were spent. And we tried to generate an experimental condition that would kind of simulate this by taking the same survey respondents and saying 5 years later, the city council asks the voters to continue funding for park maintenance. And again, it's the same scenario. In the other arm, we added the statement that the parks are well maintained, and that was the only difference here between the two experimental conditions. So either the respondents do or don't get a statement about the quality of public service being provided with this tax. And here we did find a big difference of 13 percentage points. That's massive in this domain, and it's so massive that I don't quite believe it. I think part of what's happening here might be an artifact of some of the ways we tried to basically check whether people really perceived the experimental manipulation. So we limited that analysis to people who correctly recalled whether or not the vignette mentioned the quality of public services. And when we restrict the sample in that way, it turns out we throw out a lot of people who voted no in the group that were told that services are good. I think that might be because there are some people who are just averse to the public sector, and so they are more likely to vote no on a tax and less likely to remember that you told them that public services are being well provided. So I'm not certain that we've quite yet succeeded in producing in any experimental setting the observational finding we have. But the core finding that people are more likely to continue a tax than they are to vote to have it at that level in the first place is robust. We found it in school district taxes, we found it in city taxes, we found it in county taxes, and it's the correlation that we kind of can't make go away with any of our ways of treating the data. The second finding I want to mention, and I'll walk briefly through this, is the finding that what I've heard called accountability features are popular. These are features that will allow voters to monitor whether or not a tax is being spent in the way that it was promised to them. One example here is the earmark. So earmarked taxes are more popular. That is, taxes that have a specific purpose attached to them, whether or not that earmark is legally binding. So what we did here is we coded whether or not a tax, in this particular case, was earmarked for emergency services. Here's an example. Inspired by that San Leandro emergency medical services tax. And you see a 10 percentage point difference in the percentage of voters who would endorse a tax if it was earmarked for emergency services. People want to know what they're paying for, quite understandably. We also spent some time trying to figure out what it was about particular earmarks that made them popular. Now, I want to very briefly highlight a couple findings here. So our approach here was to take those impartial analyses, that 500-word summary of the policy that goes to the voters, and to apply some natural language processing to it to try to treat it as a bag of words, a collection of tokens, and in effect to identify dimensions in the semantic space that best discriminate between the most popular and least popular of these policies. There are two dimensions, and I want to highlight one of them that I think is particularly interesting. So if you look at that upper right corner of this graph, which plots terms from these impartial analyses in semantic space, oriented such that the upper right corner of the graph is the most popular, the ones that are most likely to pass. It's a little blurry because I've overlaid words on top of each other, but you can see words like town. You can see special, that is special taxes or earmarked taxes. Paramedic, paramed here, the token for paramedical. Residential and non-residential both show up here. Medical, insurance. The paradigmatic tax in this zone is basically a local parcel tax to pay for emergency medical services, which you can think of as conceptually as a kind of local local insurance. It's a way to pool risk, and in a town, right, in a comparatively small community. And on the left side of the graph, the comparatively least popular are utility users taxes. The words here are utility, user, electricity, telephone, water, which you can think of in a sense as the opposite of risk pooling. These are taxes that basically individualize the cost of such basic public goods as having sewers, having clean water, having any connection to needed social services through the phone line, right? In effect, what we think we're finding here is, if you had to summarize the pattern, is that people prefer taxation that socializes risk, and disprefer taxation that kind of really individualizes the costs of health and social inclusion. All right. Another example of an accountability feature that's popular, a sunset clause. If you tell people, hey, this tax is forever, it's less popular than if you tell them, hey, we're going to come back to you in 5 years to reauthorize it, or we're going to come back to you in 2 years to reauthorize it. That makes it more popular still. That's interesting in part because when you think about that in combination with the finding that when you return to people the second time to vote on the same tax, it appears to be more popular. It suggests that actually the optimal strategy, if the aim is to produce politically sustainable, democratically acceptable funding mechanisms for public services, might actually be to propose a temporary tax to allow people to experience it, and then come back to them in 5 years. If it works, it will be more popular. And at that point might be reauthorized. Finally, citizens advisory commissions. This is required by law for bond measures, but not for taxation. But a lot of proposed local taxes say, hey, we're also going to set up a citizens advisory commission to monitor how the funds are spent. And if you include that provision, it's more popular, predictably more popular by a few percentage points. People like the idea of mechanisms to ensure some accountability in how taxation is spent. There are other differences with respect to sort of type of tax, and there are a lot of things we thought we might find that we didn't find with respect to frequency of payment or transparency of the tax mechanism itself. But the really big and robust findings here are that on the one hand, people prefer taxes they've already tasted to taxes they've never tasted before, and on the other hand, people seem to like what I've characterized as accountability features. So the conclusion sort of that I'm drawing from this, that's relevant to public policy and thinking about how to fund public services, is that we shouldn't try to hide taxes. There was a big discourse for a number of years about behavioral nudges, right? About designing public policies in ways that would kind of encourage pro-social behavior without making it too visible to people. And indeed, there's a literature in political science and political sociology that explicitly endorses the idea of what they call invisible taxation to support the welfare state. And the notion here is that, when you make a tax visible, you provoke people to resist it, and people are more willing to pay for things if they don't have to think about the fact that they're paying for them. That's not what we're finding. We can talk about degrees of salience and ways in which some taxes are more or less salient in ways that can be pleasant or unpleasant to people. But I think what we are finding, if I had to summarize it, is this idea that actually if the goal is to allow us as a society to pay for the public goods we say we want in ways that can politically be sustained, it behooves us to make the mechanisms transparent. And with that, I'll add the last note, which is, I also thought we might, with machine learning applied to these textual summaries of policies, produce some really excellent predictive models. And you know, I'm proud of our predictive models, but on average, they can get you within 10 percentage points of the true vote. And so the other big punchline here for practitioners is don't fire your pollster yet. There's been a lot of discourse, of course, in the social sciences about the declining quality of public opinion polling data as response rates are so low. Nevertheless, way more predictive accuracy with even a pretty low quality poll than you can get with the kind of modeling we've been able to do with aggregate data applied to this large corpus of text. So at least when it comes to tax-related behavior, public opinion polls still appear to be more useful than this alternative. Okay, on that mixed note, I'll post some of my references, and I will, conclude and say I'm eager to hear any questions or thoughts that you might have.
Thank you, Isaac. That was great. So we did already have a question. I invite others to feel free to raise your hand, or otherwise also feel free to, if you want, you can turn your screen back on or your camera on while you ask, or you can put them into the chat, whatever is most comfortable for you. So Tala asked an initial question. Tala, do you want to speak up on this, the one that you put into the chat, or shall I read it out loud for you? And if you don't speak up, I'll read it for you. But okay, I don't hear you, so I'll speak up for you. So many of our taxpayers in California are refugees and immigrants. Interested to understand more of how their voices are shaping tax policies and health implications of this.
Really, really good question. And the answer to which I do not know. I think of course, when it comes to the kinds of tax elections I'm looking at, refugees and immigrants, the voices of refugees and immigrants are really underrepresented for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is that it takes time to establish citizenship, and then with that voter eligibility, and then registration to vote is another sort of barrier in the sense that there are just a lot of procedural steps to take before you can actually be part of that electorate. Also, because these are local elections, many of them are kind of less salient to people, particularly in the last decade as local news coverage has really declined. Many of these are kind of low coverage issues. They're not what gets talked about in the news, or you don't see much about them on TV. And so only the very most politically engaged people often are voting on these issues, and political engagement tends to skew towards longtime voters, citizens, high-income people, and the like. So there are a bunch of biases, sort of systemic biases that will tend to exclude immigrant and refugee voices. I do think, I mean, I'll just sort of say that one of the things that my youthful experience I alluded to is in working for a labor union impressed me about was that, at least for the California's healthcare workforce, which includes many, many immigrants, of course, unions have been a very important mechanism, sort of political device for kind of aggregating people's voices and helping them be heard.
Thank you for that, Tal. Did you have any follow-up? I see you wrote that needs to be resigned right there. Anything else?
Yeah, fair.
No, thank you. That's great. Thanks, Dr. Morton.
Other questions? There we go. Richard, please.
Yeah, hi, Isaac. Thank you very much. Richard Garfien. I'm a professor in the same school that Eric's in, and I appreciate your presentation. And this is nice to get a new perspective on things that we don't normally talk about. I thought that your research is really compelling, that when you offer people the choice of voting on something specific, then it can tend to be popular, and people might be more willing to do that. And I think about this all the time because we're always getting, ballot initiatives to put money into the schools, building a new local school or whatever. But what I was kind of equating this with is what we're all experiencing now, where we have 1 million subscriptions to things and we sort of lose track of them, and we just know that they keep getting added to our credit cards, and eventually, once in a while we'll look at it and go, oh my God, what am I paying for? Do you see the same thing happening here? Whereas if you have a general tax, then that money goes to the government, and then you sort of trust the government to allocate that money appropriately for the things that you want, versus sort of earmarked funding like this, where we choose which things we want to spend our money on, but then that can sort of accumulate and you lose track of that. So can you speak to that issue, and what your thoughts are on how maybe we should be doing that better?
Yeah, I mean, so I have here kind of absorbed the what I'll characterize as the conventional wisdom of the profession of public administration, which is that what I've described, voting on each tax piecemeal, is a really bad way to budget, right? Because it's sort of making decisions one at a time about, hey, do you want this? Well, sure. And right, but like do I want HBO Plus or whatever? Sure, right. But then but when I make that decision, I'm not thinking about the fact that I'm already paying for Netflix, I'm already paying for Disney or whatever right. And the whole premise of a legislature is that you have a body that is charged with budgeting, with weighing competing priorities against each other, and you hope that there's a deliberative process there. So just on the grounds of kind of the quality of public deliberation, I am, I'll say, concerned about what I've heard people call ballot box budgeting, because of the way in which it does not draw our attention to trade-offs, and does not make us think about competing priorities. But there's also a really difficult issue here, which is that it has become the only game in town. And once you begin down this path of budgeting in this way, all these earmarks are created, and then the things that are not earmarked, that are paid out of the general fund may be more squeezed for funding because earmarks have been created or what have you. This is most visible at the state level in California, where a huge percentage of the state budget is earmarked by not just by law, but by state constitution, thanks to a series of ballot initiatives. And so if you have another priority, the only way to protect it from being squeezed is also to create an earmark. So it's not as, the solution here is some pretty big picture constitutional redesign. And we are a long way away from being able to do that well.
Thank you.
And Isaac, maybe you can shut off your share screen just so we can all see each other.
Yeah, of course. I'm so sorry. Thanks.
No, that's fine. There is a question from Ramona, and I invite everyone who wants to put in chat or raise your hand like Richard did. Ramona asked the question of, is there any data on differences in voting between homeowners and renters with respect to school and or property taxes?
Yes, and it is as you might expect. Well, you might actually have different expectations. So I will say, in general, with respect to property taxes, homeowners are less likely to support them than renters are. With respect to school taxes, the data are more mixed, and there is there's a very interesting line of research in economics on the question of the degree to which school quality affects home prices, and thereby indirectly people may vote for school financing because they perceive it to increase their wealth through increasing the value of their homes. But on balance, the pattern is also on average. I'm thinking of examples, at least in most studies, that homeowners are also less likely to support school taxes.
Great, thanks. Maybe I can jump in with a question for you, Isaac. So I'm curious, building on kind of, I think where your answer to Richard was, two things are kind of coming up for me when you showed that word map of different things, that sort of idea that it's less popular when you have something that's sort of in a public utility or some sort of fashion like that. That was interesting to me to sort of suggest when there are those times in which there are these basic goods that might be very hard, that might be important, but are hard to budget for, right? And then linking it to maybe the second one, it seems like that might be something that's better done in a legislative process or not, right? That's so because they might have enough, technical expertise to understand the trade-offs and to work through that, right? So I guess my one question is kind of around that of like, how do you actually, what do you see are sort of like getting outside of California, perhaps, what are the ways that might make more sense and help us to create more of a common fund and common resources for things? And so, and by extension with that, have you done explorations or seen, similar types of research from what you're doing, but from other states to sort of see if there are, other, better practices for budgeting and taxation that we might want to be considering here in California?
So I'll take the last part of that first, which is California is sufficiently unique in its reliance on this mechanism that we don't actually have. There's in a way not comparable data from other states. Of course, other states have local taxes; they just don't make people vote on them in most cases, except in very unusual circumstances. So, I did spend some time trying to figure out are there other corpora of policy text that we could use for this, and came to the conclusion that this is the California since the 1970s, contains the clear majority of elections in the history of the world in which people have been asked, would you like to be taxed this way, yes or no? Nothing comparable except in Switzerland and maybe ancient Athens. So it's a really peculiar way to govern oneself, and it does sort of raise the question, how much of this is simply about California, and to the extent that any patterns can be found here, how generalizable are they to other contexts? California is sufficiently socioeconomically diverse and sort of in terms of its economic base, in terms of its levels of economic development of its communities. Certainly in terms of its sociocultural diversity, that it's not unlike something like Western Europe in the range of political and economic contexts it exhibits. And in that respect, at least, I am hopeful that the study of California alone isn't too narrow a canvas on which to kind of try to sketch some findings. But it is the bigger question here is kind of, okay, can we find examples of places where it's done better, and in particular where we've been able to overcome the objection to funding certain kinds of public services. California is a comparatively high tax state, and it is a state in which taxation is comparatively popular relative to the rest of the U.S. So I don't, know of a lot of other examples in the U.S. To think with. I do think one of the interesting takeaways for me here is that I expected to see a lot more variation based on the specific kind of service or good that was being provided. And while it's true that anything emergency services related and anything health related is comparatively popular, it's also true that people will vote for taxes even for uncharismatic things. The central issue seems to be providing some assurance that it really is going to be spent in the way that is being promised, and providing some assurance that this is a kind of core function of providing us with a safety net of some kind in the way that is, I think, a core function of government. So when you saw the sort of negative, the word utility, right? That it's my interpretation there is not that people dislike paying for utilities. It's that utility users tax is a specific thing in California, which is a charge on your individual bill based on how much you use. And that means it's basically a price. I would prefer not to be paying tax based on how much air I breathe, right? Maybe we could share the cost of that, right? And I think that principle of kind of pooling the cost of those things that are necessary for life actually seems to be one that maps onto the data about what people will support.
Thank you for that. Others have questions? Maybe I'll throw in more, but then maybe, please, if anyone has other ones, please raise your hand, or otherwise, or put them in the chat. And then, but otherwise, maybe this could be our last question if no one has other ones. So, but this was really helpful, Isaac. So one more question for you. So, and I'm sorry, I keep going to the sort of different states, but now what you triggered with me is sort of thinking, what about those states that have relatively low taxation rates, as you brought up? You know, so
Yes.
Like Texas and Florida are pretty famous for this, right? And there's the
Sure.
discussion of people moving from California to those other places in part because
Sure.
of the taxations. And so I guess what is gained and lost in those different spaces and places? Are there different amount of services that Texas, if you know this, Texas or Florida or otherwise, offer? And is it something, yeah, like, is there some sort of unintended consequence like this works really well now, but they're sort of like building up something that will probably eventually break? Or, and I don't know if any of that's true, but like, I'm just curious of kind of that comparison from where these high tax, low tax states and what you know about those.
Yeah, I mean, so there are not huge differences state to state in the efficiency of the public dollar, and so the real differences here are in how much the public provides, rather than how efficiently it's provided. California also very high income state on average, of course, huge socioeconomic disparities, but as a very high income state has a very high cost of living, and public sector salaries are also very high. And all of that is kind of there's a piece of that that is about the price of economic development. That this is sort of one of the most consistent and important findings of public finance research since the 19th century. Is as a society grows richer, it spends more of its resources on public goods, and those public goods become more expensive. And that's, it's sort of how we choose to spend our wealth. So I will say, I'm not in love with the quality of the roads and bridges in California. There's a lot to be desired in terms of the quality of some of the public services that are provided. But I am not aware of a state that does it consistently better.
Thanks for that. All right, Richard, thank you again for.
So this is a philosophical question, and since I have a sociologist who's interested in taxes, I thought I would ask this. But if you don't have an answer, don't be afraid to just say, that's a really interesting question. Let me think about that and get back to you someday.
Sure.
In public health, we rely a lot on either government funding or now more so than ever, philanthropic organizations, foundations to pay for the things that we need to do, whether it's the research studies or the programs that we're trying to implement. And I struggle with this idea that as a society, we give huge tax benefits to corporations who then make a few people very, very, very rich. And then the way that they deal with that is they take some of that wealth and they kindly give it back to us in the form of, foundation grants or philanthropic activities, which they end up being the ones deciding how it gets used. So rather than us paying taxes, and that tax money gets decided by a legislature to figure out how it would best be used. We all have some say in it. We sort of allow these very rich, very open, very kind-hearted people to decide what it is that gets done. And now we have some influence on that because we can go and petition those really rich people and make the case for what we want to do with that money. And so I'm not saying that one's better than the other, but it's something that I think that I've been grappling with a lot and trying to figure out, where are we going as a society, and is this how we want to? Is this actually a better way to, spend our money than taxes? And I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts.
I'm in agreement and with the concern. I think, and I'll be blunt and say I think it's an undemocratic delegation of power to the very rich. I would much rather that tax rates be applied consistently. Much less of a tax break for philanthropy, and instead, put that resource into the public sector and let us decide together how to spend it. That seems to me to be much more defensible on grounds of, I suppose it's political philosophy and ethics. I think the other thing I would add to that is, in a way, this is sort of an even more disturbing thought, is that I think it's not just the very rich. If you poke the American income tax code even a little bit, and then if you start to scratch at local tax law the way that I've done, special tax breaks are everywhere, and they're not just for rich people. And even the ones that aren't for rich people are a little bit inequitable in the ways that they shake out, in ways that are sometimes quite complicated. My go-to example here is the tax limitation from Proposition 13. This is a cap on how much property tax you can owe. And so this 1978 ballot measure said, okay, your local property tax rate can't go above 1%, and the value of your home that we write down for tax purposes can't increase more than 2% per year, no matter how much the actual value of your home increases. So if you've been sitting on a home in California, in a coastal California city since the 1970s, the value of that home has gone through the roof, and every year you've gotten effectively a bigger and bigger tax break, which is the difference between what that home is worth and what the property tax assessor says it's worth for tax purposes. Now that sounds, if you have one of these homes, if you own a home in California, right? This is the idea of sort of surrendering that tax break is kind of terrifying, because it probably means your tax bill would go up a lot. It would be quite economically disruptive to the state. And yet, state law has been written in such a way that these tax breaks can be passed down from parents to children when you bequeath your home. It is special treatment under law for owners of a particular kind of property. It looks to me like the beginning of a hereditary aristocracy, and I don't mean that figuratively. I think there's something sort of feudal happening in the state, and yet it benefits a lot of low and middle income people also, who just happen to own homes. So I'm really if anything, an extreme alarmist about tax breaks. And I look at histories of European feudalism, and I see a world built on tax breaks, and I don't like what I see, and I'm nervous about the direction of drift.
Thank you for that, Isaac. Any last questions? Maybe just putting it in, I did put in, there is a book, in case others haven't read it, this book, Winners Take All, which discusses that issue quite a bit. And then another one just to flag, and maybe actually just, I'm throwing out books. I invite you, maybe as a last thought, any key books or ideas that you might want to invite others to read. But what you were just describing, Isaac, sounded a lot like Capital and Ideology to me, Thomas Piketty's tome or Capital and Ideology in particular, that one as a structure. So I seemed you were playing through that. So
no, that wonderful book worth reading. I also, if you get interested in these questions about like the public sort of thinking and public willingness to pay for public goods in the United States, there's a scholar at the Brookings Institution named Vanessa Williamson who wrote a brilliant, brilliant book called Read Our Lips, that just very carefully documents actually all the ways in which people in the United States, you know, feel very positively towards taxation under certain conditions. And a lot of it is about, you know, wanting assurance that other people are paying their fair share too, so that I don't feel like a chump when I pay. But it's just sort of beautiful and rock solid research. So I'm a huge fan of everything Vanessa Williamson writes on this subject. In terms of sort of thinking through big picture implications for kind of public health and public provision, I will say our colleague in the Department of Sociology, Lane Kenworthy, and I'm not going to single out a particular book of his because the guy kind of cranks them out, and they're all very good. But he's spent a lot of time doing comparative work looking at the high income comparatively democratic countries. So basically Western Europe, the Antipodes, Japan, and the United States and Canada. Looking at their political economic models and how do these societies pay for healthcare? How do these societies pay for pensions for the elderly? How do they treat sick leave, right? The sort of basic stuff we're all familiar with, kind of American exceptionalism in this domain being exceptionally ill provided in matters of health. But Lane's work in looking at the aggregate level at kind of performance of a whole society across a range of well-being indicators and the way that that's associated with kind of different economic models for setting things up is just to me, a very useful kind of observational check on our ideological intuitions around this stuff. And so I just will also make a plea for joining the Lane Kenworthy fan club.
Thank you, Isaac. And I just threw in, as you were talking, I threw in links to the things you just mentioned, partially so I could keep myself.
Yeah.
So.
Wonderful.
All right, if there's nothing else, thank you all. Thank you, Isaac, for taking the time. Thank you all for listening in. Any last thoughts, comments, questions? Going once. Going twice.
I'll just say thank you. Yeah, no, really, really wonderful. So appreciate the chance to talk about the work and yeah, look forward to remaining in touch with those of you who wish.
Be well. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks again, Isaac. This was great.